Excessive friendliness is not always a personality trait. In many cases, it's a learned survival mechanism, a response rooted in the body's stress regulation systems. When the brain perceives threat or disapproval, it triggers one of four major responses: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Fawning is the behavior most associated with people pleasing and over accommodation. This isn't about kindness or warmth in a healthy social context. It's about using friendliness to avoid perceived danger or conflict. The autonomic nervous system, which regulates our stress responses, becomes dysregulated through chronic exposure to emotional threats, such as rejection, abandonment, or criticism, especially in early life. Over time, the nervous system may come to view assertiveness as unsafe. Instead, it adapts by developing behavior patterns that soothe others, defer opinions, and suppress one's true thoughts or emotions. This means a person might smile when they're angry, agree when they disagree, or accommodate others while betraying their own needs. These reactions become reflexive, a hardwired pattern, not a conscious choice. This kind of over-friendliness is often mislabeled as being nice or good-natured, but it's important to recognize the biological mechanism at play. Fawning behaviors involve activation of the parasympathetic nervous system in a maladaptive way, shutting down self-expression to maintain social harmony. These patterns are reinforced by the temporary relief of avoiding confrontation or receiving approval, which the brain interprets as success. The problem is, over time, this conditioning erodes authenticity and personal agency. When someone is constantly trying to appease others, they're actually triggering and reinforcing neural pathways associated with anxiety and social threat. The amygdala, the brain's fear center, becomes overactive, and the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for rational thinking and decision-making, becomes less efficient. The more you operate from a place of excessive friendliness, the more your brain interprets social interaction as a threat to be managed rather than a space for connection. This leads to a hyper, vigilant social posture, always scanning for cues of disapproval, always working to keep others happy, even at great personal cost. In many cases, the root of this pattern lies in early relational experiences. A child who learned that love, safety, or attention was conditional upon being good, agreeable, or helpful may internalize the idea that friendliness is the only path to acceptance. This belief becomes biologically encoded through repeated neural firing and behavioral reinforcement. By the time this person reaches adulthood, the pattern is so deeply embedded that they can't distinguish genuine kindness from performative people pleasing. This also affects hormonal regulation. Chronic people pleasing can dysregulate cortisol rhythms, the stress hormone, resulting in emotional fatigue, difficulty concentrating, and poor immune function. Excessive friendliness is physically draining because it puts the brain and body in a perpetual state of vigilance and self-monitoring. Instead of relaxing into authentic presence, the person is constantly adjusting, editing, and tailoring their behavior to fit what they think others want to see. Understanding this as a physiological pattern, not just a psychological one, is essential for change. Once we identify that over-friendliness is actually a stress response, we can begin to address it through targeted interventions that regulate the nervous system and retrain behavioral defaults. Techniques such as breath work, cold exposure, deliberate discomfort, and behavioral boundary setting can rewire the brain to feel safe in moments of assertiveness or disagreement. These practices regulate the amygdala and strengthen the medial prefrontal cortex, helping the individual reclaim emotional self, control, and authenticity in their social life. This isn't about becoming cold or detached. It's about shifting from survival-driven friendliness to regulated, conscious social behavior. It's about teaching the nervous system that it's safe to say no, to speak up, and to be real. Only then can true self-respect and healthy interpersonal dynamics begin to emerge. The human brain is biologically wired to seek rewards. This drive is governed largely by the brain's dopaminergic system, a network that includes structures like the ventral tegmental area, vitae, nucleus accumbens, and prefrontal cortex. Dopamine, often misunderstood as a pleasure chemical, is actually more about motivation and anticipation of reward. It drives us to pursue actions we associate with satisfaction, status, approval, or relief. Excessive friendliness exploits this very system, creating a loop in which external validation becomes the primary source of neural reward. When someone is overly friendly or constantly accommodating others, the brain quickly begins to associate those actions with a dopamine hit. For instance, when you compliment someone and they smile, when you agree to help and receive praise, or when you avoid conflict and feel temporary relief, each of these outcomes activates the reward centers in the brain. Over time, this forms a conditioned loop: be nice, get rewarded. This behavior becomes more reflexive and less intentional as the brain starts prioritizing short-term approval over long-term authenticity. The danger in this pattern is subtle but profound. The brain's reward system begins to prioritize external validation instead of intrinsic values like self-respect, clarity, or personal goals. In neuroscience terms, this is a misallocation of motivational salience. The brain is now encoding being liked as a high priority objective, often at the cost of truth, energy, and growth. You become a performer instead of a participant in your life. Rather than asking, is this right for me? The brain asks, will they approve of this? This creates a dependency loop. Similar to how addictive substances hijack the dopamine system, excessive friendliness and people-pleasing behaviors keep the brain in a cycle of seeking the next hit of approval, attention, or gratitude. This loop is self-reinforcing. Every time you avoid a difficult conversation by being overly nice and someone reacts positively, your brain records that avoidance as a successful strategy. The result is that you become neurologically conditioned to equate excessive friendliness with safety and reward, even when it's damaging your relationships and well-being. There's also a critical impact on long-term cognitive health. When your brain is constantly focused on external feedback, it drains your executive functions, the part of the brain involved in planning, reflection, and emotional regulation. Over time, this leads to mental fatigue and even identity confusion. You may start to lose a clear sense of who you are, what you value, or what you really want, because your actions are being driven by what others expect rather than what's true for you. The brain's reward system is highly plastic, which means it adapts quickly to repeated behavior. If friendliness is used to earn approval or avoid discomfort repeatedly, those circuits become dominant. This makes alternative responses, like saying no, asserting a boundary, or expressing an unpopular opinion, feel threatening or unrewarding, even if they are healthy. This is why even the thought of disappointing someone can create anxiety. Your brain anticipates a loss of reward and reacts with resistance. Another layer of this hijack involves social hierarchy and status perception. The brain's anterior cingulate cortex monitors our social standing and tracks how we're perceived by others. When friendliness earns praise or attention, especially in group settings, the brain encodes this as a status increase. This activates a sense of belonging and reduces social threat, two powerful forces that the human brain evolved to prioritize for survival. But when this system is relied upon, it suppresses more complex emotional responses and sacrifices authenticity for acceptance. One of the most insidious effects of this pattern is that it rewards the suppression of negative emotions. If every time you feel anger, disappointment, or frustration, you mask it with a smile or a polite response, the brain starts interpreting emotional honesty as a liability. Over time, this leads to emotional repression, increased stress, and reduced emotional resilience. You become neurologically trained to ignore your true feelings in favor of feelings that please others, disconnecting you from your own internal signals and intuition. This neural hijack also stunts risk-taking behavior. Growth, whether personal, professional, or relational, requires discomfort. But if your dopamine system is overly tied to friendliness and smooth social exchanges, then difficult but necessary actions, like saying no, disappointing someone, or choosing discomfort for long-term gain, feel like threats instead of opportunities. You become trapped in low-stakes, low-reward behavior patterns that offer temporary comfort but long-term dissatisfaction. The brain thrives on structure, predictability, and efficiency. Much like how muscles grow stronger through resistance and rest, the brain develops more resilient and effective patterns when it encounters challenges followed by recovery and integration. One of the most overlooked yet powerful tools for improving mental clarity, emotional stability, and behavioral precision is setting and maintaining clear boundaries. These boundaries, social, emotional, cognitive, act as internal signals that define what is acceptable and what is not. From a neuroscience perspective, boundaries reduce decision fatigue, conserve energy, and sharpen executive function, all of which are crucial for long-term well-being and goal attainment. Every moment you spend navigating unclear social dynamics, wondering whether to say yes or no, trying to predict someone's reaction, managing discomfort from being overextended, drains your brain's cognitive resources. The prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for decision making, emotional regulation, and goal setting, functions best when it's not overloaded with uncertainty or ambiguity. Boundaries serve as filters. They minimize unnecessary inputs, making it easier for the brain to focus on relevant tasks, self-directed goals, and authentic behavior. When you consistently say yes to things that violate your limits or contradict your values, your brain enters a state of low-grade stress. Cortisol levels elevate slightly, keeping the sympathetic nervous system activated. This chronic sympathetic tone reduces access to the parasympathetic rest and digest state, which is essential for creativity, reflection, and emotional regulation. Over time, this imbalance diminishes cognitive flexibility and heightens emotional reactivity. In simple terms, you become more distracted, more irritable, and less grounded, all because your neural resources are being drained by people pleasing and over accommodation. Setting boundaries strengthens what neuroscientists call top-down regulation, where the prefrontal cortex asserts control over more primal brain regions like the amygdala and limbic system. For example, when you are asked to do something that conflicts with your priorities and you calmly say no, your brain practices a form of behavioral inhibition. This deliberate pause, choosing alignment over automatic approval, reinforces neural pathways linked to self-control, self-awareness, and long-term planning. The more you repeat this process, the more efficient those pathways become. This is neuroplasticity in action. Without boundaries, you leave your attention wide open to intrusion. This not only affects your focus, but also your identity. Your sense of self begins to blur when you're constantly adapting to others' needs or expectations. But when you establish firm limits, not harsh or reactive, but clear and consistent, your brain begins to internalize a more stable self-image. You become less reactive to external feedback and more attuned to internal signals, which is essential for self-authorship and autonomy. Identity is not just a psychological construct. It is a neurological pattern built through repeated intentional behavior. Another important neural benefit of boundary setting is that it improves what's called working memory capacity. When you're not preoccupied with maintaining an artificial sense of harmony or scanning for signs of disapproval, your brain is freer to hold and manipulate information relevant to your current goals. This makes you more productive, more creative, and more strategic. Cognitive bandwidth increases when emotional noise decreases, and boundaries reduce that noise significantly. Even on a hormonal level, clear boundaries affect how your body regulates stress and energy. When you honor your own time, space, and limits, your brain shifts toward homeostasis. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenals HPA axis, a key stress response system, becomes less reactive. This helps normalize cortisol rhythms, increase resilience, and improve sleep. All of these factors compound over time to build stronger cognitive and emotional function. In other words, boundaries don't just protect your time, they optimize your biology. One of the reasons people struggle to set boundaries is that the brain fears short-term social disruption more than long-term internal damage. Saying no might trigger someone's disappointment or frustration, which the brain perceives as a threat to connection or belonging. But each time you uphold a boundary and survive the discomfort, the brain recalibrates its threat response. It learns that conflict doesn't equal danger and that truth-telling enhances rather than harms your sense of safety. This feedback loop increases your psychological flexibility, a trait highly correlated with both mental health and high performance. The result is not only a more efficient brain, but also a more stable, grounded version of yourself who can focus, choose, and act with intention rather than compulsion. Assertiveness is not just a personality trait. It's a trainable neural behavior that directly impacts how the brain processes identity, self-worth, and agency. When you express your thoughts clearly, enforce your boundaries, and communicate your needs, especially under pressure, you are doing much more than managing relationships. You are rewiring the brain. Specifically, you're strengthening the connectivity between key brain regions like the medial prefrontal cortex, insula, and anterior cingulate cortex, areas involved in self-awareness, interception, internal body signals, decision-making, and emotional regulation. These areas form what can be called the confidence circuit, and every act of assertiveness helps reinforce it. To understand why assertiveness has such a profound neurological effect, consider how the brain processes uncertainty. When we avoid speaking up, whether to dodge conflict or maintain social approval, the brain typically operates from a state of ambiguity and mild threat. This keeps the amygdala, the brain's fear center, subtly activated, which in turn reduces the functional power of the prefrontal cortex, the very part of the brain responsible for making rational, value-aligned decisions. Over time, this avoidance pattern wires the brain to believe that silence equals safety and expression equals danger. The result is reduced emotional resilience, diminished self-confidence, and a weakened sense of internal authority. But assertiveness flips this script. When you communicate your thoughts clearly and stand your ground respectfully, even when uncomfortable, your brain processes that moment as a success, a resolved challenge. Dopaminergic pathways light up because you've taken a step aligned with your own values and self-interest. That dopamine spike is important. It serves as a reward that reinforces the assertive behavior and makes it more likely that your brain will default to it again under similar conditions. Through this mechanism, assertiveness becomes a learned, reinforced behavior that shifts your default from appeasement to agency. The insula plays a unique role in this shift. It's the part of the brain responsible for processing internal body states, how we feel physiologically when something happens. When you're assertive, especially in situations that previously triggered anxiety or self-suppression, the insula helps the brain register the new bodily response: a steadier breathing, clearer voice, grounded posture. The more these physiological responses become associated with assertiveness rather than fear, the more your nervous system reorients to see direct expression as a normal, safe behavior rather than a risky one. This is how internal safety gets rewired through external action. In addition, assertiveness enhances self-referential processing, which occurs mainly in the medial prefrontal cortex. This region is heavily involved in how we perceive ourselves, not based on external validation, but through internal evaluation. Each time you assert yourself, you give your brain evidence of self-trust. You begin to perceive yourself not as someone who avoids or hides, but as someone capable of facing discomfort, holding tension, and still acting in alignment with truth. Over time, this enhances your self-concept in a measurable, biological way. In a literal sense, you're altering your identity from the inside out. Another critical mechanism is behavioral repetition. The more often you engage in assertive communication, the stronger the neural pathways become. This is neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to rewire itself in response to repeated action. Like training a muscle, each repetition of assertiveness builds more synaptic strength between neurons responsible for that action. Initially, the behavior may feel clunky or forced, but over time, it becomes second nature. The circuit supporting your confidence becomes not only active, but automatic, which reduces hesitation, anxiety, and internal conflict. It's also important to understand that assertiveness reduces what's known as cognitive dissonance, the psychological tension that arises when your actions don't align with your values or beliefs. Every time you remain silent when you want to speak or agree when you truly disagree, your brain registers that dissonance. It creates a small but measurable stress response. Over time, these small compromises build up into chronic stress patterns, reduced motivation, and even mood disorders. Assertiveness, by contrast, aligns thought, emotion, and behavior. This alignment leads to coherence within the brain's motivational and regulatory systems, producing not just confidence, but inner clarity. Moreover, assertiveness activates and strengthens the anterior cingulate cortex, which helps resolve social conflicts and detect when behaviors align or misalign with goals. When you assertively communicate in challenging moments, this region helps you process social discomfort while keeping your goals and personal standards in view. The brain begins to register tension not as something to avoid, but as a sign that meaningful growth is occurring, which transforms how you interpret discomfort itself, not as a threat, but as a signal for presence and courage. At first glance, being agreeable seems like a positive social trait. It's associated with kindness, flexibility, and consideration. But when agreeableness becomes chronic, when you consistently prioritize harmony over truth, validation over authenticity, and approval over integrity, it becomes a form of self-betrayal. From a neurobiological standpoint, excessive agreeableness is not a virtue, but a signal of diminished internal value. It reflects a brain and body system that has been conditioned to devalue personal needs. minimize internal conflict by avoiding external conflict, and default to appeasement over assertiveness. The root of chronic agreeableness often lies in early experiences where one's emotions or boundaries were dismissed, punished, or ignored. Over time, the brain adapts by creating survival strategies that focus on external attunement, scanning the environment for cues of approval or disapproval, and adjusting behavior accordingly. This external orientation becomes neurologically ingrained. The default mode network, which governs self-referential thought and social processing, becomes overactive in contexts where personal boundaries should be leading the response. The individual becomes hyper-aware of what others want but disconnected from what they need themselves. Biologically, this creates a kind of internal suppression. The emotional centers of the brain, particularly the amygdala and insula, become conditioned to interpret self, expression, or disagreement as unsafe. Even minor interpersonal friction can trigger a stress response. Cortisol levels rise, the heart rate increases, and the sympathetic nervous system activates, all because the nervous system perceives disagreement as a threat. In this way, excessive agreeableness is not a sign of balance or maturity, but rather of a nervous system that lacks the capacity to tolerate interpersonal tension. It reflects a brain that has not been trained to feel safe in its own authenticity. This pattern of behavior sends continuous feedback to the brain that one's needs, boundaries, or opinions are less important than others. That feedback loop erodes self-value. The medial prefrontal cortex, which plays a critical role in self-evaluation and decision-making, begins to register your repeated self-suppression as evidence that your own desires don't matter. This weakens not just confidence, but the very structure of identity. You begin to define yourself not by who you are, but by how others see you, think of you, or feel about you. Over time, this results in a fragmented sense of self, emotional exhaustion, and often a quiet sense of resentment that is difficult to trace but hard to ignore. Excessive agreeableness also affects the regulation of important neurotransmitters such as serotonin and dopamine. When you constantly put others first to gain approval or avoid conflict, your brain's serotonin system, which helps modulate mood, self-esteem, and social dominance, becomes imbalanced. You are telling your brain that you are lower in the social hierarchy. In evolutionary terms, serotonin levels are higher when an organism perceives itself to have status, power, or safety. When your behavior communicates low self-priority, serotonin regulation suffers, leading to mood swings, insecurity, and lack of assertiveness. This dynamic also creates long-term fatigue in the prefrontal cortex, as it has to continuously override internal impulses in favor of social performance. Every time you suppress a truth, smile when uncomfortable, or say yes when you mean no, your brain uses cognitive resources to maintain the act. This results in what's known as ego depletion, a state of mental and emotional drain that impairs your ability to make strong decisions, regulate emotions, and pursue meaningful goals. Furthermore, chronic agreeableness can lead to what psychologists call identity diffusion. Without a consistent practice of standing up for your beliefs, values, and needs, the brain loses clarity about what those things actually are. You begin to absorb the perspectives, moods, and desires of those around you. Your inner voice becomes quieter while external voices grow louder. This not only weakens decision-making, it diminishes motivation. When you are disconnected from your own goals or values, the dopaminergic system responsible for motivation and drive becomes underactivated. You're not motivated because you're not living for yourself. You're performing roles for others, and the brain knows it's inauthentic. On a social level, excessive agreeableness may temporarily smooth interactions, but it often leads to long-term relational instability. People may not respect you, even if they like you. Lack of respect eventually leads to boundary violations, imbalance, and frustration. Your behavior communicates that you don't value yourself enough to be honest, and others subconsciously respond to that energy. In neurobehavioral terms, people calibrate their expectations and behaviors based on the signals you give them. And when those signals are overly accommodating, you teach others that your time, energy, and space are negotiable even when they shouldn't be. Social respect is not granted automatically, nor is it achieved through constant friendliness or endless accommodation. Respect, in its most enduring form, is earned through consistency, clarity, and self-authenticity. From a neurobiological and behavioral science perspective, the human brain is wired to detect congruence, alignment between what someone feels, thinks, and does. When others perceive authenticity, the brain registers it as coherence, stability, and trustworthiness. When someone is too friendly at the expense of truth or agreeable at the cost of self-expression, this mismatch registers as noise. It may not always be conscious, but at a deep cognitive level, people sense the dissonance and respond to it with distance, doubt, or even dismissal. Authenticity begins in the brain's limbic system, particularly the anterior insula and medial prefrontal cortex, where emotional self-awareness and value integration occur. These areas are activated when a person reflects honestly on what they feel, why they feel it, and how to express that feeling in action. The more aligned these internal processes are, the more predictable and grounded the person becomes. Predictability in behavior, from a social neuroscience standpoint, increases trust. When someone is consistent in how they present themselves, regardless of whether they're liked, the brain categorizes them as safe, stable, and clear. These are the neural foundations of respect. In contrast, inauthentic behavior, over-friendliness, constant approval, seeking or saying yes when you mean no, activates what's known as social prediction error in others. The brain expects congruence between facial expression, tone, and body language. When it detects subtle misalignments like forced smiles, incongruent agreement, or suppressed tension, the amygdala and anterior cingulate cortex flag these signals as social red flags. Even if the person engaging in this behavior believes they are being helpful or nice, others may interpret their energy as unstable or unreliable. This leads not to closeness or respect, but to avoidance or superficial interaction. From a behavioral standpoint, authenticity requires the ability to tolerate discomfort. When you express a boundary, share an unpopular opinion, or stay silent rather than offering forced support, your nervous system may register a temporary threat. The sympathetic nervous system activates, creating sensations of unease, a fast heartbeat, shallow breath, or muscle tension. However, each time you stay grounded in those moments and continue acting in alignment with your values, the brain adapts. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which governs emotional regulation and risk processing, begins to recalibrate. It learns that speaking your truth does not result in social catastrophe, but rather in clarity and stronger relational boundaries. This neuroadaptive process gradually reshapes how you relate to others. Rather than filtering your expression through the lens of approval, your communication becomes driven by clarity and integrity. And as this becomes your default pattern, others begin to respond differently. Even if they don't always agree with you, they know where you stand. That predictability fosters respect. In social groups, whether personal or professional, individuals who display stable, congruent behavior tend to become reference points. Others consult them for guidance, follow their lead, or consider their input with greater weight. This isn't due to charisma or dominance, but to the neurological weight of authenticity. There's also a connection between authenticity and mirror neurons, the brain's empathy and social modeling system. When someone communicates from a grounded place, especially when doing so calmly and directly, mirror neurons in the listener's brain begin to resonate with that calm state. This creates psychological attunement, where the other person begins to feel safe and connected. The paradox is that when you stop trying to be liked and instead become real, people feel more emotionally attuned to you. The brain seeks realness even when it comes with challenge or disagreement. On the hormonal level, authenticity also regulates oxytocin, often called the trust hormone. Oxytocin release is closely tied to the perception of emotional honesty and vulnerability. When someone reveals their true feelings or sets a clear boundary in a respectful way, oxytocin levels can increase in both parties, deepening the social bond. This strengthens mutual trust and respect far more than accommodation or superficial harmony ever could. The neurochemical message is clear. Authenticity fosters closeness, and closeness, when built on honesty, creates stable respect.